Hey, so I've been using the Oppo Find X5 Pro for the last month or so, and I've got to say it's left me impressed in a lot of different departments. Now, before we get into the full review, if you are new, I like to make videos on long-term reviews of smartphones where I just sit down and talk about my experience of using a smartphone. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe to this channel. And if you want to see short-term video content, make sure to follow me on Instagram, on Shorts, as well as on Reels. But without further ado, enough self-promotion, let's get into the Oppo Find X5 Pro. So the design is really unique. I tended to think that the glossy finish would have been something that I wouldn't grow on, but it's something that I've grown to adapt to. Plus, this design of this camera bump, I think is one of the best ones I've seen on any flagship. I think going back to any typical flagship is going to be pretty difficult for me because it's so sleek, it's so flush. I kind of love it. Now, in terms of durability, this thing is Gorilla Glass Victus protected on the front, and it's got a ceramic back. So in terms of dropping the smartphone or just, general wear and tear, I don't think you're going to be finding that many dents or that many creases. I have dropped it once and nothing's happened to the smartphone, thankfully. So I don't think it's going to get in the way. If you want to stay extra safe, make sure to have a case. I think one is provided out of the box with the Oppo Find X5 Pro, so you can go ahead and toss that on. But I don't like using cases with my smartphone, so I just keep it naked, if that's the right word. It's 8.8 millimeters thick, but it doesn't feel like it, and 218 grams, although Oppo has done really well in terms of weight distribution, and even for smaller hands like mine, I think using the smartphone isn't going to be a big chore. Now, last but not least, this thing also has IP68 certification, so if you're going to use it in the rain or you're going to use it in the shower, I don't think you'll have to worry about it. I've used it for the last 2 or 3 weeks doing all of that, and nothing's happened to the smartphone. It's been a-okay. So in terms of durability, in terms of design, in terms of build quality, I've pretty much got no complaints with this phone. And well, that brings me on to the second most important aspect of any smartphone, which is the display. Now, this display is a 6.7-inch panel, and one of the coolest things about this is this animation. When you unlock the smartphone like so, you sort of get this really cool animation effect, which I don't know if Oppo has made proprietary. I've never seen it in the past, so in terms of that, I think the display just sort of gets at you right as soon as you unlock the smartphone, and overall it's a pretty good panel to look at. I've had no complaints with multimedia consumption. It's an OLED panel, it's a full 120 Hz panel, so on that regard there is nothing to complain about. Even outdoors, visibility is great. You do have to crank up the brightness a bit more than sort of 75%, so I go all the way up to 100% when I'm outdoors. And in terms of usability, it's been fantastic. The only one complaint I have with the display is that it's curved. So when it's curved, you sort of, when you're pinching it, you get these false touches on the display, which kind of makes things go all over the place. And this is also applicable when you're using the smartphone with water droplets on top of the display. So you cannot use the smartphone with water on top. This is something that I have been able to do with other smartphones to more of an extent as compared to the Oppo Find X5 Pro. It's not a big deal. You just have to wipe the water off and then you'll be able to use it just fine. But I thought I would point it out just for those people who are interested. In terms of the speakers, it's a dual speaker setup, stereo speakers. Nothing really to point out. It's just plain normal stereo speakers. So I don't have much to say, but in terms of the display and multimedia experience, I don't think you can go wrong with it. It's a Quad HD Plus panel as well. So yeah, you're pretty much sorted when it comes to multimedia when you're using the smartphone. Now, I did mention about the 120 Hz refresh rate, and this sort of ties in with the power on the smartphone. So the power inside is the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor. This is one of the first times I've ever used this chipset on a smartphone, and to be honest, it's blazing fast. When it comes to multimedia, when it comes to navigation, when it comes to gaming, all of that is pretty much well handled. The only time performance is a bit choppy, and I know this is not to be expected on a phone like this, but I have to point it out, is when you are using the smartphone for extended gaming sessions. What happens is the smartphone tends to heat up on the back. This is also applicable when you're doing a long Google Meet, for example, when you're using the smartphone to video chat. That's also when this thing is prevalent, but basically it heats up. Because it heats up, the processor sort of has to downclock, and because of that, you sort of get dropped frames and a choppy experience when you're navigating through the UI. That is the only instance where I found this smartphone to be a bit lackluster, but aside from that, if you're using it regularly, you shouldn't have any problems whatsoever. There's up to 512 gigabytes of storage depending on which model you pick up, and 12 gigabytes of RAM. When it comes to RAM as well, one thing to point out is that while you're multitasking all over the place, it can hold a lot of applications in memory, but for some odd reasons, just sometimes Twitter decides to go out of memory, or Facebook goes out of memory. So I guess the RAM management isn't as consistent as it should be on a smartphone like this, and I think the majority of that goes down to how ColorOS is optimized on this Android 12 running device. So like I mentioned, ColorOS 12.1 is what you have on the smartphone. Thus far, I haven't had any updates of security patches or anything like that on the smartphone. So I haven't had any updates in the last month. And in terms of the overall user experience, it's not something that I am too not familiar with. I've used it over the last couple of years actually, and I've grown fond of it. I think TouchWiz or Samsung's One UI is number one for Android skins. Number two is ColorOS. I think ColorOS just has this adaptability, it has this convenience factor, and just everything likes to flow, and it's in a manner that's optimized well. There are some instances where it still needs to be optimized, so things like RAM management need to get better. And when I trigger dark mode, I don't know for what reason, but sometimes the dark text that you see on screen sort of just disappears because I think it forgets that it's in dark mode. So when I've been using this smartphone, I've been using it in light mode for the most part. So I haven't done any dark mode tweaks on ColorOS 12 because I like to stay away from UI glitches. Sometimes what happens is that it tends to reproduce a website in dark mode when it's not supposed to be. I remember Tech Radar's website was displayed in dark mode, but it wasn't supposed to be. So yeah, these kind of small things that need ironing out. I think ColorOS 13 or whatever they decide to call it will have some improvements on that regard. But that aside, I think the overall general experience, I wouldn't say has been anything drastically bad, and I have nothing to point out when it comes to how this thing has performed over the last 1 or 2 weeks. So yeah, I think generally when it comes to the Oppo Find X5 Pro, the one thing you have to look out for is that performance throttling, and you also have to look out for that display not working at the full 120 Hz. But that aside, I think it's a good time now to move to the camera of the smartphone. Now, the camera on the smartphone is kind of unique. You'll be able to see it right behind me, and it's a 50 megapixel sensor on the back, as well as a 13 megapixel one alongside another 15 megapixel sensor. So what happens here is the 50 megapixel primary sensor and the 50 megapixel other sensor is the ultra wide sensor. So in terms of regular photos as well as the ultra wide photos, I think this smartphone does a really good job of neglecting any fisheye look to images, and I was particularly impressed by how much of an extent it reduces it by. It's still very slightly visible, but I think it does a phenomenal job. But what happens is between the wide and the ultra wide lens, the color science and the way colors are represented is a bit off. Now, this is Hasselblad powered. I don't know if the hardware on this thing is Hasselblad powered, but I do know the software is. And for a phone that is touting photography, I feel like there should be a better match between the wide and the ultra wide angle lens. Although that sort of is similar also with the telephoto lens. So even at 2x zoom, you sort of get this different color shade, different hues compared to the wide, and it's a completely different palette to the ultra wide. So I think the consistency between the ultra wide, wide, and the telephoto lens when it comes to colors is a bit lacking, and that is something that Oppo will need to work on in the coming months, either to improve this smartphone experience or to improve it in the next one. Also, this has the Silicon chip, which is a proprietary Oppo chip that improves photography performance, and I think it does play a role in nighttime photography, where even with the ultra wide angle camera, the nighttime photos are just absolutely impeccable. But I still do think that video needs improvement. Now you do have the option for AI highlight video at 4K resolution, which is something you didn't have prior, but even so, I just feel like video quality on this smartphone doesn't live up to the same extent as, let's say, an iPhone 13, where just video is the best and there's nothing really that comes close to the iPhone, especially if you want to upload to social media. That's where Android smartphones like Oppo's, like Samsung's, all of these need to buck up. Samsung has been trying in the past to optimize the Instagram experience to make sure that social media is a bit more optimized for its smartphones, but I think Oppo needs to do the same. As well as that, I think Oppo was one of the first ever brands to come up with this zoom concept of 10x zoom. I remember Oppo doing this with the Oppo Reno series at 10x space zoom and then going all the way up to I think 50x as well. But I don't know why for this smartphone they've capped it once again at 30x. I think they could have really capitalized on a technology where zoom could have been emphasized. If not 2x, maybe 5x optical zoom could have been something that Oppo looked at. But for this smartphone, you don't get that either. So in terms of the camera package, nighttime performance and just overall general performance of the ultra wide angle lens are some of the points that stand out. But as a camera unit on the overall, I still think it needs some work. I think the optimization with the Mari silicon chip is there, but it needs to be further there when it comes to video optimization as well as color optimization across the different lenses. But one of the things that pretty much makes no sacrifice on this smartphone is battery. Say 5000 milliamp hour battery on this unit. It's an 80 watt charging capacity that you get on the battery, which means 50% in 12 minutes and a full charge wirelessly in 47 minutes. And both of these are applicable. I can just plug in my phone, wait for 10 minutes, and it's already at 50%, which is absolutely incredible. But I don't really need to charge the phone that often because when it comes to battery endurance, this smartphone is great too. You get 6, 7, 8 hours of screen on time depending on how much you push the smartphone. And when it comes to the overall regular day, this thing always lasts one full day, which is really convenient for anyone who's outside working for 12 to 14 hours of their day and don't have time to charge the smartphone. This thing can work on 5G and Wi-Fi simultaneously and get you through the day very easily. So I've got to say, when it comes to battery optimization and battery performance, this thing has absolutely crushed it. Props to Oppo for doing that. And that's as far as my experience with the smartphone goes. Now, for someone who is looking for a smartphone at this price point, should you consider the Oppo Find X5 Pro or should you consider, let's say, the Honor Magic 4 Pro? I think the Oppo Find X5 Pro is definitely the one to consider in this price bracket because not only do you get really good durability, really good design, you also get a better camera experience in my opinion. You also get a better endurance rating. I've heard that the Honor Magic 4 Pro, there's water resistance on it, but it doesn't kind of live up to the water resistance rating. So sometimes it does get damaged by water. I haven't had that issue here. I also prefer Oppo's UI when compared to Honor's UI. So yeah, when it comes to that direct comparison, I think Oppo really has nailed the sweet spot. If you're looking for something a bit lower, there's nothing really 500 dirhams lower that will get you the same value for money. So even then, I'd recommend spending that extra money for the Oppo Find X5 Pro. But if you are looking for something above that, or maybe not officially in the market, but somewhere where let's say the Galaxy S22 Ultra is cheaper and available for the same price as the Oppo Find X5 Pro, then definitely the Galaxy S22 Ultra is the better value for money because you get a better camera unit, you get arguably a more polished software experience and just added features when it comes to software richness, which I don't think Oppo has with ColorOS 12.1 just yet. So yeah, those were my thoughts on the Oppo Find X5 Pro. Like I said, if you want short videos, make sure to follow me on my socials. And if you want videos like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more coming up. This was Vaibhav, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.